The Galactic Academy was a place where legends were born. It was the highest institute of training for warriors, scientists, and leaders from every corner of the galaxy. Only the strongest minds and the toughest bodies passed its brutal tests. And among all the trials, there was one that stood above the rest, the ordeal of pain. The ordeal was not just a test of strength, it was a test of soul. It measured endurance, willpower, and the very essence of a being's spirit. Every species feared it, for it was designed to break them. Even the most resilient warriors of the Zarkan Empire, known for surviving in lava oceans, had fallen before reaching level 10. The Academy had a saying carved above the chamber where the ordeal took place. No one can withstand pain level 10. It had never been proven wrong. On a cold morning beneath the twin suns of the Academy world, a crowd gathered outside the pain hall. Students, instructors, soldiers, and scientists filled the viewing decks, eager to watch the new challenger. Rumors had spread quickly. A human, a species still considered primitive by most galactic standards, had volunteered to attempt the trial. Laughter rippled through the crowd. "A human, are they mad?" hissed a scaled Psylocke officer. "They break under pressure suits. They'll never reach level 5, chuckled a Cathari cadet. "Let them try," growled a hulking Zoran veteran. "At least it will be entertaining." Humans were known across the galaxy for their curiosity and adaptability, but not for their durability. To most species, they were weak, fragile creatures with soft skin and brittle bones. The idea that one could even attempt the ordeal was ridiculous. The chamber doors slid open, and silence fell. The human walked in slowly, step by step, as if he carried no weight at all. He was not tall or muscular. His uniform was plain, his face unremarkable. But there was something in his eyes, a calm, steady fire that made even the veterans stop laughing. His name was Commander Elias Gray, a decorated soldier from Earth. He had fought in wars, survived starvation, endured years in enemy prisons. To him, pain was not a stranger. It was an old companion. "Commander Gray," the examiner said, a towering insectoid creature with a voice like grinding metal. "Do you understand the conditions of the ordeal?" "I do," Elias replied quietly. "You may withdraw at any point. Once you pass level 7, you are under no obligation to continue. No one has ever survived beyond level 10. Elias' lips curved into a faint smile. "Then you'd better prepare level 11. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some laughed again, but this time it was nervous. Others simply stared, unsure if he was joking. The chamber sealed behind him. The ordeal had begun. Level 1 was simple, controlled bursts of neural pain transmitted directly into his nervous system. Most beings barely felt it. Elias didn't even flinch. He stood perfectly still, his eyes closed, breathing steadily. Level 2 increased the intensity. It felt like being burned by acid from the inside. His heart rate rose slightly, but his expression remained calm. By level 3, the pain crawled through his bones. He clenched his jaw but did not cry out. The crowd began to grow silent. By level 4, the sensation was like molten metal pouring through his veins. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but his breathing remained slow and steady. At level 5, even the Zarkan veterans in the crowd, the ones who had once tried the ordeal, began to watch in uneasy silence. The neural impulses tore through his muscles. His skin felt like it was peeling, and every heartbeat became a scream inside his chest. Still he stood. "His vitals are stable," whispered one of the medics in disbelief. "He's not even close to passing out." "Impossible," hissed a Psylocke instructor. "No one maintains composure past level 5. Inside the chamber, Elias thought of the faces he had seen in war, the friends he had lost, the people who had died because he wasn't strong enough. Pain was nothing compared to that. Pain was just a reminder that he was still alive, and as long as he was alive, he could keep going. Level 6 began. His body convulsed violently, every nerve on fire. Pain radiated from his spine, crawled into his skull, and pressed against his thoughts like a vice. Many challengers had broken here, screaming for the trial to stop. Elias clenched his fists and whispered something under his breath. "Is that singing?" one observer asked. He was humming an old Earth melody, a lullaby his mother used to sing when he was a boy. It was his way of telling the pain that it didn't own him. Level 7 brought hallucinations. Most species lost their minds under the strain. Elias saw flashes of memory, his unit pinned down in the mud, the sky burning, the silence after an explosion. But instead of fear, he felt something else, determination. He had survived that. He could survive this. By level 8, his skin split and bled under the stress. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, his vision blurred, but he did not fall. By level 9, the crowd was dead silent. No one laughed now. The legends had said no one could reach this far, yet the human still stood, his eyes burning with that same calm fire. "Activate level 10, the examiner ordered, his voice unsteady. The final level was beyond agony. It was pure destruction, the body screaming to shut down, the mind begging for mercy. Elias collapsed to one knee, blood dripping from his lips. His heart stuttered. His vision went dark. But he did not yield. He raised his head and smiled through the blood. "That's 10, he whispered. "Start at 11. The chamber erupted in chaos. Students shouted. Instructors stared. The examiner froze. No one had ever spoken those words. No one had ever asked for more. For the first time in the Academy's history, the legend was broken. The impossible had been defied, and it was done by a creature the galaxy had called fragile. That day, the Academy learned a truth it would never forget. Pain was a weapon, but to a human it was also fuel. And Elias Gray had only just begun. The chamber was silent. Even the machines seemed to hesitate as if they understood that something extraordinary had just happened. The human, Commander Elias Gray, was still kneeling, blood pooling beneath him, his breath shallow but steady. He had survived level 10, the limit no being had ever crossed, and now he had asked for more. "Start at 11, he repeated, his voice hoarse but unwavering. The examiner hesitated. There is no level 11, it was never designed. Elias raised his head slowly, and his eyes locked on the insectoid official. Then build it. The room erupted into chaos. Scientists argued, instructors shouted, and medical teams rushed forward, only for Elias to raise a trembling hand to stop them. "Don't touch me," he said. "I'm not finished." The Academy had built the ordeal to measure the limits of every species. Now, for the first time, they were being forced to redefine those limits. The decision was made. The system, though never intended to go beyond level 10, had emergency protocols, higher pain calibrations that were deemed unsafe and forbidden. With trembling claws, the examiner activated them. Warnings flashed across the control panel. Caution, neural pain level EXCEDS safe, PARAMETRS. Risk, nervous system failure, mental collapse likely. Proceed, Elias whispered. And level 11 began. It was nothing like before. Pain was no longer a sensation. It was an ocean, endless and suffocating. It was a fire that didn't burn the skin but the soul itself. His body seized violently, muscles tearing, bones vibrating under the assault. Blood poured from his nose and ears. His heartbeat became erratic. The crowd that had mocked him before now watched in stunned horror. Some turned away. Others pressed closer, unable to look yet unable to look away. How is he still alive?" whispered a young cadet. "No being can survive that," hissed a Zoran officer. "And yet," murmured the examiner, "he does." Inside the chamber, Elias screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear or surrender, it was raw, primal defiance. His mind was breaking apart, but his will refused to follow. "I have felt worse," he told himself. "I have lost more." The pain dragged him into memory. He was no longer in the chamber. He was back on Solstice Prime, a ruined battlefield where the ground was littered with the bodies of his comrades. He remembered crawling through mud with a shattered leg, carrying a wounded friend on his back. He remembered the cold bite of shrapnel lodged in his ribs, the hunger that gnawed at him for days, the screams of the dying. This pain was nothing compared to the ache of watching those he loved die. It was nothing compared to the silence that followed. "Is that all you have?" Elias whispered through gritted teeth. "Is that all?" Minutes passed, then an hour. The crowd began to shift uneasily. No one had ever lasted this long beyond level 8, let alone level 11. The medical team begged the examiner to stop the trial. "His organs are failing," one doctor shouted. "We're going to lose him." But the examiner, eyes fixed on the human, shook his head. "He hasn't given the signal." And Elias never did. He clung to consciousness by the thinnest thread, his body screaming for mercy, his mind fighting to stay intact. His heart faltered and steadied, faltered again. Every breath felt like knives in his lungs, and yet he endured. The galaxy was watching. Across thousands of systems, the live broadcast of the trial had spread. Entire species who once mocked humanity now stared in disbelief. Soldiers who had called humans weak felt shame. Scholars who had labeled them primitive began rewriting their theories. A simple creature of flesh and bone was enduring what their most advanced beings could not. On the observation deck, a silent commander spoke softly, almost to himself. Pain is supposed to be the end, but for him it's only the beginning. Inside the chamber, Elias was barely conscious. The world around him flickered and warped. The pain had become something else now, not an enemy, but a companion. It walked beside him, whispered to him, tested him. "You are not enough," the pain said in his mind. "You will break." "I've been broken before," he whispered back, "and I stood up again." His vision blurred. He saw his sister's face, smiling before she was taken by disease. He saw his commander's last salute before the final battle. He saw the faces of every person who had told him he was weak. And then he smiled. The examiner's hands hovered over the emergency shutdown switch. "Another minute and his nervous system collapses," one medic warned. But before they could act, a sound echoed through the chamber, laughter. Weak, hoarse, but unmistakable. Elias was laughing. Why is he laughing?" a cadet stammered. "Because he had won, not over the pain, not over the academy, but over the part of himself that had once believed he couldn't." When the system finally powered down, the chamber was silent again. Elias lay motionless, his body broken and trembling. Medical teams rushed in, checking vitals, stabilizing his failing organs. "Commander Gray," a voice said gently, "can you hear me?" His lips moved. It took everything he had to speak. "Was that 11? The examiner nodded, still shaken. "Yes, that was level 11. Elias opened one swollen eye and grinned faintly. "Then next time, we'll start at 12. The room erupted, not with laughter, but with stunned applause. Even the most arrogant cadets stood and saluted. The name human no longer meant fragile. It meant unbreakable. And beyond the academy walls, across the stars, countless species repeated the same whispered truth. Pain is our limit, but for humans, it's their fuel. That day, something changed. The ordeal of pain was no longer a measure of endurance. It was a story. And at the center of that story was a human who refused to stop. The galaxy had witnessed strength before, but never like this, never with such stubborn, beautiful defiance. And Commander Elias Gray had only just begun to show them what humanity was truly capable of. The days following the Level 11 ordeal changed everything. The Galactic Academy, once a place of arrogance and certainty, was now a place of questions. The impossible had been done. The test they believed no living being could survive had been conquered by a human. And not only had he survived, he had asked for more. Commander Elias Gray had become more than a soldier, more than a challenger. He was a symbol of willpower, defiance, and a spirit that refused to die. Across the galaxy, people spoke his name with reverence. And yet, deep inside the academy, one question remained unanswered. How far could he go? Elias spent 3 days in the recovery wing. Machines hummed beside him, healing his shattered body, repairing torn muscles, and stabilizing his weakened heart. Most beings would have been bedridden for months if they survived at all. Elias was already sitting up by the 2nd day. By the 3rd, he was standing. Doctors begged him to rest. Commanders advised him to stop. Even the Academy High Council recommended he retire with honors. He had already proven humanity's strength. But Elias refused. "I'm not done," he said, his voice quiet but unshakable. "There's still a higher wall to climb." The council was stunned. "You mean to attempt level 12? Elias met their gaze, his eyes steady as stone. "I mean to break the wall completely." The announcement spread like wildfire. Billions tuned in from across the galaxy. Even species that had once despised humanity were now watching with awe. The Pain Hall, once just another test chamber, had become the center of history. On the day of the trial, the stands were full. The audience wasn't laughing this time. They were silent, respectful, almost reverent. They weren't watching a human, they were watching a living legend. When Elias entered, the room fell still. He looked thinner, older, marked by scars from the previous ordeal. But his presence was stronger than ever. He walked to the center of the chamber with slow, steady steps, as if each step was a promise. The examiner approached him. "Commander Gray, you are under no obligation to continue. No one will think less of you." "I'm not doing this for them," Elias said softly. "I'm doing it for the ones who never had the choice to stop." The examiner hesitated, then bowed. "Begin the sequence." Level 12 was not pain, it was annihilation. The moment the sequence started, Elias felt every nerve in his body ignite like fire. His bones screamed as if they were being crushed under the weight of a star. His blood boiled, his vision exploded into white-hot agony. His muscles convulsed, tearing against themselves. Every instinct in his body begged him to surrender. Every heartbeat was a question: why are you still here? And yet he did not fall. "Vitals dropping rapidly," shouted a medic from the observation deck. "His brain activity is spiking beyond safe thresholds," another warned. "Shut it down," someone cried. "No," whispered the examiner, watching Elias through the glass. "He's still fighting." Inside the chamber, Elias drifted in and out of consciousness. Reality twisted and broke apart. Pain no longer felt like pain, it felt like drowning, like burning, like falling into an endless void. His body screamed, but his mind clung to one truth: "I am still here." He saw memories, not as visions, but as anchors. His mother's smile, the faces of the soldiers who had followed him into battle, the promise he had made to never let their sacrifice be forgotten. "Not yet," he growled through blood-stained teeth. "Not yet." At the 30-minute mark, his heart stopped for 3 seconds before restarting. His skin blistered and tore. His muscles trembled with every breath. And still he endured. The crowd was no longer silent. They were standing, watching with tears in their eyes. They were witnessing something beyond strength. This was not about power or pride anymore. This was about the human will, the unstoppable force that refused to break, no matter the cost. A veteran Zarkan warrior turned to his apprentice. "I once believed strength was measured by muscle and armor," he said softly. "I was wrong. It is measured here." He tapped his chest. "Inside." At the 40-minute mark, the system reached its absolute limit. Alarms blared across the chamber. "Warning, neural overload, life signs critical, immediate shutdown recommended." "Shut it down," shouted one of the doctors. "He won't survive another second." But before anyone could act, Elias raised his trembling hand. His lips moved slowly, painfully. "Not enough." The room went dead silent. "Commander Gray," the examiner said, his voice shaking, "this is beyond level 12. No system has ever gone this far." "Then make it 13. The decision to continue was madness, and yet they obeyed. The system surged to new levels, deeper than anything recorded before, and when it did, something extraordinary happened. Elias stopped screaming. His body still convulsed, his heart still faltered, but his face was calm. The pain no longer controlled him, he controlled it. In that moment, he was not a victim, he was not a subject, he was a conqueror. He looked up at the observation deck, blood streaming down his face, and whispered 3 words that would echo through history. "Pain is nothing." When the system finally shut down, Commander Elias Gray collapsed. His body was broken, his pulse weak, his breath shallow. Medical teams rushed in, pulling him from the platform. He was unconscious, but alive. Against every law of biology, every prediction of science, alive. The crowd rose to their feet. The silence shattered into a thunderous roar. Even the most stoic instructors saluted. Even the proudest warriors bowed. The galaxy had seen strength before, but never like this. Never with such beauty, such defiance, such unyielding spirit. Weeks later, when Elias finally awoke in the medical ward, the examiner was waiting beside his bed. "You broke the unbreakable," the alien said quietly. "You showed us that pain is not the end." Elias smiled weakly. "Pain is just another lesson." "And what did you learn?" "That there's always another level." From that day on, the Academy changed its motto. The old words above the chamber, "No one can withstand pain level 10, were gone. In their place was a new phrase, carved into the wall in bold letters. "Pain ends where humanity begins." And beside it a name, Commander Elias Gray. Commander Elias Gray became a legend overnight. The galaxy spoke his name with awe and fear. Entire academies rewrote their training manuals. Soldiers whispered about the human who broke the impossible. But to those who truly knew him, Elias was not a legend. He was a man carved by suffering, molded by loss, and defined by the pain he had already survived long before the academy ever tested him. To understand why Elias never broke, you had to understand who he was before he walked into that chamber. Elias Gray was born in a small mining colony on the outer edge of the Sol system. Life there was not easy. The air was thin, the winters were long, and hunger was a familiar enemy. His father worked in the mines. His mother grew food in rocky soil that barely sustained them. They had little, but they had love, and for a time that was enough. But when Elias was 12, the war came. The Orion conflict swept across the colonies like wildfire, and their world became a battlefield. One night, the sky burned red as enemy ships descended. Bombs fell. Fires consumed entire towns. Elias remembered running with his mother through the smoke, clutching her hand as explosions shook the ground. He remembered the blast that threw them apart. He remembered her screaming his name as the fire swallowed her. He never saw her again. From that moment, pain was no longer just a physical thing to Elias. It was the emptiness that followed. The ache that sat heavy in his chest and never left. The guilt of surviving when others didn't. At 16, he enlisted in the Earth Defense Forces. They said he was too young. He lied. They needed soldiers and he needed a purpose. Training was brutal, sleepless nights, endless drills, hunger, exhaustion. Many recruits quit. Elias never did. He wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but he was the one who never stayed down. Pain became his teacher. Every broken bone, every blister, every tear, it taught him how to endure. It taught him how to keep going. At 20, Elias was deployed to Solstice Prime, one of the bloodiest battlefields in human history. The enemy's bioweapons swept through the trenches like storms. Soldiers died screaming, their bodies dissolving in front of his eyes. Elias learned to fight with broken ribs, to crawl with a shattered leg, to breathe through blood. One night, his unit was ambushed. He and 12 others were captured and thrown into a prison camp deep in enemy territory. There, the real ordeal began. For 9 months, he was starved, beaten, and tortured. They burned his skin, broke his bones, tried to break his mind. But every time they came for him, he looked them in the eye and said the same thing. "Is that all?" He watched men stronger than him shatter and beg for mercy. He buried friends who could not survive, but he refused to kneel. Pain is just a message, he told himself, and messages can be ignored. When the war finally ended and the prisoners were freed, Elias walked out of that camp on his own 2 feet. He was 50 pounds lighter, his body scarred beyond recognition, but he was alive. And he had learned the most important lesson of all. Pain is not power, endurance is. Back in the Academy's medical ward, as Elias recovered from level 13, reporters begged for interviews. Soldiers came to shake his hand. Students asked for advice, but he turned most of them away. He didn't want glory. He didn't want fame. He only wanted people to understand the truth. One evening, a young cadet named Lyra approached his bed. She was barely 20, her hands trembling as she saluted. "Sir," she said softly, "how do you do it? How do you survive pain like that?" Elias looked at her for a long time before answering. "You don't survive pain by fighting it," he said. "You survive it by accepting it. You let it pass through you and you keep walking." "But aren't you afraid?" she asked. "Of course I am," he said. "Fear never goes away, but if you listen to fear, you stop moving, and the moment you stop, you lose." Lyra nodded slowly. In that moment, she understood something no training manual could teach. That strength was not about being fearless or invincible. It was about refusing to stop no matter how much it hurts. When the doctors finally cleared Elias to leave the ward, he didn't go back to Earth. He walked straight to the pain hall and stared at the chamber that had tried and failed to break him. He placed his hand on the cold metal and closed his eyes. "This is nothing," he whispered. "I've felt worse." He wasn't talking about the pain of machines or neural shocks. He was talking about the night his home burned, the months in the prison camp, the faces of the friends he'd buried. No machine could come close to the agony of memory. And that was why the machines would never win. News of Elias' story spread beyond the Academy. Across the galaxy, survivors of war, victims of oppression, and those who had lost everything found hope in his example. They saw in him a truth that transcended species. That strength was not born from power or technology, but from the heart's refusal to surrender. A Threxian poet wrote, "Where pain ends, the human begins, and where the human begins, nothing can stop them." That night, Elias stood alone under the twin moons of the Academy world. The wind was cold against his scars, but it felt good. It reminded him he was still alive. He thought of his mother, of the soldiers who never came home, of the broken boy who had once cried in the ashes of his village. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man who had turned suffering into strength. Pain was no longer his enemy. It was his oldest companion and his greatest teacher. And the next time the Academy tried to test the limits of endurance, Elias Gray would be waiting. Not to prove he could survive, but to prove that humans could endure anything. The day Elias Gray returned to the chamber, the galaxy held its breath. The stories of his past had spread far and wide. The boy who had survived war, the soldier who had endured torture, the man who had shattered every limit the Academy believed unbreakable. Yet now he was coming back, not to repeat history, but to go beyond it. The council had tried to stop him. They said the human body could not endure more. They said he was risking his life for no reason. But Elias did not listen. He wasn't doing this to prove anything to them. He was doing it because he believed that every boundary existed to be broken, and because somewhere out there, another young soldier or frightened child might need proof that pain was not the end. When he stepped into the pain hall once more, silence swept over the crowd. This time there was no laughter, no arrogance, no doubt. Everyone present, warriors, scholars, generals, even former enemies, stood in quiet respect. The examiner, the same insectoid official from before, met his eyes. "Commander Gray, you don't have to do this. You've already proven more than anyone in history." Elias smiled faintly. "I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here to see how far I can go." The new trial was called Level Omega. It wasn't a standard test. It wasn't part of the Academy's curriculum. It was an experimental program designed as a theoretical maximum, a level never meant to be attempted. The simulations suggested that any being subjected to Omega would die within minutes. Elias volunteered anyway. The examiner's claw hovered over the activation switch. "Once this starts, we can't stop it without risking fatal shock. Are you sure?" Elias nodded once. "I've been sure since the day I walked in here." The chamber sealed, the crowd fell silent, and the countdown began. Omega was not pain, as anyone understood it. It was total destruction. The moment the system engaged, Elias' world exploded. Every nerve in his body screamed at once. His bones felt like they were being shattered into dust. His heart convulsed under unimaginable pressure. His mind flooded with signals so intense that his consciousness began to flicker. He screamed not in fear but in rage. It was the roar of a man refusing to die, the cry of a soul that had already survived hell and would not bow to anything less. The medical teams monitoring him were horrified. "He's going into cardiac arrest," one shouted. "His neural pathways are collapsing," cried another. "Shut it down before it kills him." But the examiner shook his head, eyes fixed on the human who stood against the impossible. "He hasn't given up," he whispered. "He's still fighting." Inside the chamber, Elias was falling apart. His vision shattered into flashes of white and red. He could no longer feel his limbs. His heart felt like it might burst. Every breath was a knife. Every thought was a war. Yet deep inside there was a spark, a single, unyielding spark that refused to go out. He remembered his mother's smile. He remembered the faces of the soldiers who had died under his command. He remembered the promises he had made to endure, to rise, to never stop. And he whispered into the storm, "Not yet." Minutes felt like hours. Each second stretched into eternity. Elias was no longer fighting the machine, he was fighting himself. His body screamed for mercy. His brain begged for unconsciousness, but his spirit refused. "I have walked through worse," he told himself. "I have crawled through the mud of war. I have starved. I have been beaten. I have buried everyone I love. This is nothing. This is just more." And with that thought, he pushed himself upright. His legs trembled. His skin bled. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he stood. The crowd erupted. The monitors showed readings no one had ever seen before, levels of endurance so far beyond known biology that scientists were calling them impossible. "His pain threshold, it's off the charts," one whispered. "It's like his mind doesn't even recognize the signal anymore." At the 15-minute mark, something remarkable happened. The machine was still firing pain into his body, but Elias was no longer reacting. His heart rate stabilized, his breathing evened, his eyes opened, calm and steady. "What's happening?" asked a medic. The examiner stared in awe. "He's adapting." Inside the chamber, Elias felt the pain change. It was still there, vast and merciless, but it no longer controlled him. It was part of him now, like the beat of his heart or the rhythm of his breath. "You don't scare me," he whispered into the void. "You never did." At the 20-minute mark, the Omega system began to overload. The safety systems had never been meant to run this long. Lights flickered. Alarms screamed. The chamber groaned under the strain. "Shut it down," the technicians yelled. But before they could, the system burned out. The pain vanished. The silence that followed was deafening. And in that silence, Elias was still standing. When the doors opened, he collapsed into the arms of the medics. His body was ruined, bones fractured, muscles torn, nerves fried. He had pushed himself to the edge of death and somehow returned. As they carried him out, he looked up at the examiner with a faint, broken smile. "Was that all?" he whispered. The examiner, a being who had believed nothing could surprise him, felt something he had not felt in centuries: humility. "Yes," he said softly, "that was all." For weeks afterward, the galaxy spoke of nothing else. They called Elias the Endurer. They called him the man who broke Omega. Entire civilizations rewrote their definitions of pain and strength. The very concept of limit no longer meant what it once did. But Elias did not care about the titles. Lying in the recovery wing, hooked to machines that kept him alive, he only cared about one thing: that somewhere, someone watching would learn what he had learned. That pain does not define you. That limits are meant to be shattered. That the human spirit is infinite. Months later, when he finally walked again, he returned to the chamber one last time. He stood before it, scarred and changed, and placed a hand on the cold steel door. "This is where I met myself," he whispered, "and I learned I cannot be broken." The Academy's motto changed once again. Beneath the words "pain ends where humanity begins," a new phrase was added. Weeks passed after the Omega trial, and the galaxy was no longer the same. Commander Elias Gray's name had crossed borders, languages, and even species lines. He was no longer just a soldier, no longer just a man. He had become a living symbol of the one thing that connected all sentient life: the will to rise after falling, the courage to endure even when there was nothing left. The Academy halls, once filled with arrogance and laughter at the thought of weak humans, now echoed with a different kind of sound: quiet respect. Where there had once been mockery, there was now silence. Where there had been disbelief, there was now reverence. And where the motto had once been, "No one can withstand pain level 10," the words engraved above the chamber now read, "Humanity endures." But Elias' story was far from over. While he recovered, students from hundreds of species visited the medical wing just to see him. Some brought gifts, some came to thank him, and others simply stood in silence beside his bed, as if being near him gave them strength. One day, a young Threxian soldier, part of the same species that had once tortured Elias during the war, walked in nervously. He had 4 eyes and a scarred jaw, and his hands shook as he saluted. "I was taught that humans were weak," he said quietly. "I was taught that you break easily, but I watched you stand when the universe itself tried to crush you. You changed what I believe strength is." Elias, still pale and thin from the ordeal, smiled faintly. "Strength isn't about being unbreakable," he said. "It's about choosing to stand up again even when you're already broken." The Threxian's eyes glistened. "Then I will try too." Word of those words spread faster than any official broadcast, and soon something extraordinary began to happen. Species that had never attempted the pain trials before began stepping into the chamber. Zarkins, Silex, Orin, and even the proud Cathari, all of them entered, not to beat Elias' record, but to test themselves in the way he had shown them. Many failed, some fainted, others screamed for the trial to stop, but every single one of them walked out with their heads held higher than before. The Academy had created the ordeal to measure suffering. Elias had transformed it into a lesson in courage. Elias' recovery was slow and painful. His body had been pushed beyond what anyone believed possible. There were days when his legs refused to move, nights when his heart skipped dangerously, moments when the doctors whispered that he might never fully heal. But he did not let that stop him. He forced himself to walk one agonizing step at a time. He retrained his muscles. He strengthened his lungs. He rebuilt himself piece by piece, just as he always had. And every time someone told him to rest, he answered the same way, "I'm not done yet." During his recovery, the Galactic Council invited him to speak. Billions tuned in across the galaxy to hear what the man who had endured the impossible would say. When Elias stepped onto the stage, leaning slightly on a cane but standing tall, the crowd fell silent. He looked out at the sea of faces, alien and human alike, and began to speak in a calm, steady voice. "Pain is something we all understand," he said. "It's the one thing that doesn't care what world you come from or what shape you were born in. It finds us all. It tries to break us all." He paused, his eyes scanning the audience. But pain is not the enemy. It is the teacher. It shows us who we are. It shows us how far we're willing to go. And it reminds us that no matter how deep we fall, we can always rise again. There was silence, not because they were bored, but because they were moved. Many had tears in their eyes. "I am not special," Elias continued. "I am just a man who refused to stop, and so can you. Every single one of you can stand up again. That is what it means to be alive. That is what it means to endure." When he finished, the entire hall stood in one massive ovation, not just for him, but for the truth he had spoken. In the years that followed, the ordeal of pain was no longer just a trial. It became a rite of passage, a symbol of resilience, a ceremony of courage. People no longer entered it to prove they were the strongest. They entered it to prove they would not give up. Statues of Elias Gray were built on worlds he had never visited. His words were carved into the walls of academies across the stars. And his story became part of every child's education, a reminder that strength was not measured by power, but by perseverance. And yet Elias himself remained humble. He refused titles, declined medals, and lived a quiet life as an instructor at the academy. His greatest joy was not the fame, but watching others rise. One evening, years after the Omega trial, he stood outside the chamber once again. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. He watched as a young Psylocke cadet entered the ordeal, trembling with fear. He watched as she screamed, stumbled, and then, just like he had, stood back up. A smile touched his lips. "This," he whispered, "was always the point." Later that night, Elias visited the memorial garden outside the academy. It was a quiet place filled with engraved names, those who had faced the ordeal and fallen. He placed his hand on the cold stone and closed his eyes. "I carried pain so others wouldn't have to fear it," he said softly. "But they will surpass me one day, they must." And deep down, he knew they would, because the spirit that could not die was not just his, it was in all of them. It was in every being who chose to stand one more time, even when standing seemed impossible. Pain had once been the galaxy's greatest weapon. Now, because of one human, it had become a measure of hope. And the lesson was written not just in history books, but in the hearts of countless beings who now understood that the most powerful force in the universe was not strength, not intelligence, not technology, but endurance. Because pain ends, but the will to rise never does. And humanity has no end. Years passed. The galaxy changed, and with it so did the Academy. Once a place that measured strength by brute force, it now measured it by resilience, patience, and will. The ordeal of pain, once a feared punishment, had become a sacred test, a rite of courage shared by species from every corner of the stars. At the heart of that transformation stood one man, Commander Elias Gray. The legend of the human who had broken every barrier, who had endured the impossible and still asked for more, had grown larger than life. Statues of him stood in great halls. Songs were written in his name. And yet, Elias himself had always remained simple, a man who preferred quiet evenings under the stars, a teacher who spoke softly to students, and a soul who never forgot where he came from. But time, as it always does, continued to move forward, and even legends are not immune to its passing. Elias grew older. His once strong body carried scars that time refused to heal. His steps slowed, his hands trembled, and his heart, the heart that had withstood everything, began to tire. The doctors warned him that he would not live forever. He only smiled. "I never expected to," he said. "I just expected to live." And live he did, fully, fiercely, and with purpose. But deep down, he knew that his story was reaching its final chapter. On the day of his retirement ceremony, thousands gathered in the Academy's central plaza. Every seat was filled, every balcony lined. Representatives from over 100 species stood shoulder to shoulder. Even the council, once the doubters and mockers, now came to honor the man they once underestimated. When Elias stepped onto the stage, leaning on his cane, the crowd fell completely silent. He had no medals on his chest, no crown on his head, only the calm, quiet eyes of a man who had lived 1,000 lives in one. He stood before the crowd and spoke with the same steady voice he had used in battlefields and classrooms alike. "I came here many years ago as a soldier," he began. "I thought I was here to prove something, that humans were strong, that we could endure what others could not. But that's not what this was ever about." He looked around the plaza, meeting the eyes of beings who had once been enemies, now standing together as allies. "It was never about me," he continued. "It was about us, all of us. Every living being who has ever faced pain and thought they couldn't go on, every soul who has fallen and stood back up again, every heart that has broken and still chosen to love. That is strength. That is what makes us alive." There were no cheers, no roars, only tears and silence. Every word was a weight carried deep into their hearts. After the ceremony, Elias walked alone to the ordeal chamber, the place where everything had begun. It had changed over the years. The walls were engraved with the names of those who had faced the trial. Quotes from challengers lined the corridors, and at the center of the hall, carved into the floor, were his own words. "Pain is not the enemy, it is the teacher." He stood before the great door one last time, his hands resting on the cold metal. "This chamber taught me who I was," he whispered, "and now it's time for me to leave it behind." But before he turned away, he noticed a group of young cadets standing nearby. They looked at him with wide eyes, nervous, hopeful, determined. "Are you afraid?" he asked. One of them nodded. "Yes, sir, very." Elias smiled gently. "Good, that means you're ready. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to walk forward with it." The cadets swallowed hard and stepped into the chamber. Elias watched them go, a spark of pride glowing in his chest. The torch was being passed. The future was ready. Later that evening, Elias returned to his quarters overlooking the academy's gardens. The twin moons hung low in the sky, bathing the world in silver light. He sat quietly by the window, feeling the cool breeze on his skin. His body was weak now. His breath came slower. But his spirit, the spirit that had carried him through war, torture, and pain beyond imagining, burned as fiercely as ever. He closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him. His mother's smile, the fire of his childhood home, the faces of the soldiers he'd led, the screams in the chamber, the tears of those he had inspired. All of it, the suffering and the triumph, the despair and the hope, had been worth it. "Thank you," he whispered into the night, "for every scar, for every trial, for every lesson." And then with a faint smile he added, "Start at 11. When morning came, the sun rose over the academy like a golden crown. Elias Gray was gone, peacefully, quietly, as if he had simply closed his eyes after a long, beautiful journey. The galaxy mourned, but it did not mourn in despair. It mourned with gratitude. It mourned with strength. Because Elias' story did not end with his passing. It lived on in the ordeal chamber, in the students who faced their fears, in the soldiers who refused to surrender, and in the hearts of countless beings who now understood what it meant to endure. Statues and monuments were built, yes, but the greatest monument of all was unseen. It was the strength within every being who whispered his name when they needed courage. Years later, a young child, a human born long after Elias' death, stood before the ordeal chamber. Her father asked if she was afraid. "A little," she admitted. "What do we say when we're afraid?" he asked. She smiled, her heart steady. "Start at 11. And in that simple phrase, the legacy of Commander Elias Gray, the man who had taught the galaxy that pain could never defeat the spirit, lived on. For pain has an end, but courage lasts forever.